Human trafficking is a term we hear everywhere, in headlines, on social media, and whispered through our communities. But how much do we really understand about what it is, who it impacts, and how to respond? I'm Miko Anderson, and this is the Traffic Report, a podcast from Equitas. This season, we'll sit down with survivors, prosecutors, advocates, and allies, not only to uncover the impact of human trafficking, but to focus on what comes next, the strategies, reforms, and community-driven solutions survivors need from us. We'll look at where systems fall short, and we'll highlight the innovations that practitioners are building to make support safer, stronger, and sustainable. Together, we'll explore what it takes to create real and lasting change. When trafficking cases make it to court, survivors are often expected to behave like the perfect witness, to be calm, clear, and consistent. But trauma doesn't always happen that way. Survivors might struggle to remember details, shut down emotionally, or even seem defiant. And these aren't signs of deception. They're normal, predictable trauma responses. And too often, the system misreads them, and survivors get labeled as uncooperative, and cases fall apart. But what if, instead of fighting against the trauma, we built prosecutions that accounted for it? What if evidence, digital records, physical proof, corroborating witnesses could carry the weight while prosecutors explain to juries why trauma looks the way it does? To really understand how the courtroom can adapt and what it takes to build prosecutions that reflect the realities of trauma, I'm joined by someone today who's been leading this work on the front lines, David Weiss. David Weiss is the chief of the Human Trafficking Unit at the Kings County District Attorney's Office and the law enforcement lead for the Department of Justice-funded Brooklyn Human Trafficking Task Force. He's been prosecuting human trafficking cases since 2014, leading groundbreaking investigations that shut down trafficking operations, brought federal charges, all while maintaining survivor-centered processes. He helps prosecutors and investigators understand how to build evidence-based cases so that they don't solely rely on victim testimony. He's even testified before the New York State Assembly on expanding the statute of limitations for trafficking cases. And earlier this year, he was recognized as Prosecutor of the Year by Homeland Security Investigations. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Miko. Pleasure to be here.
And I just want to set the scene because I know you have handled a lot of prosecutions and dealt with many different trauma responses and victim responses and the perception of those responses. Can you tell us, when it comes to, quote unquote, a failure to appear in trafficking cases, what does it actually look like when you're prosecuting the case? And how is that different from some of the other violent crime that you prosecuted?
So failure to appear when it comes to a trafficking case can come from many reasons. And we have to figure out what those reasons are that require where that victim now no longer wants to participate and show up in court. Whether it's there was an element of coercion, intimidation, they just got scared, it was too daunting for them. We have to recognize that this is not just, we don't care anymore, we want to move on. Oftentimes there is an underlying reason that caused them to be unavailable, or it got too much for them and they needed to step back for their own healing and for their own understanding. Different than violent crime situations sometimes where failure to appear is for varying reasons, but we have options where we would do what's called a material witness order, where on a shooting case, potentially, like we can have detectives serve a subpoena to require a victim or a witness to come in and testify to a shooting or a violent crime that they saw. When it comes to the trafficking cases with gender-based violence victims and severe victims of trafficking, we will not do that. We are not going to use the threat of a court subpoena and arrest to force a victim to testify, to further that traumatization, further that exploitation, and kind of only enforcing the message that the traffickers have put on them, saying, the police, the prosecutor, they only care about you for their perspective and they don't actually care about your well-being. And that just reinforces that message when we're going and arresting people that we know are the victims.
Two things about what you said really resonate with my experience when it comes to working with traffickers. When we talk about failure to appear, we talk about it sometimes in the literal sense, like someone failing to come to court after they've been subpoenaed to do so, and then the actions that we take, and how it's necessary to be trauma informed and not escalate with, like you said, material witness body attachments is what we call them here in California. But also, even when some survivors came to court, right, that they weren't fully present because they had so much trauma or other priorities, or it wasn't necessarily of their own doing. So recognizing that coercion, that intimidation as part of the actual case, that it's not unusual and it's something that happens quite often when it comes to these cases, I think it's important to hit home. And then finally, the part about how these cases are different from violent crimes, that piece where the vulnerability exists that traffickers exploit makes sometimes survivors at so much a more heightened risk for any other activity. So whether it's court process or something else. So just recognizing that, I think is a huge step, because a lot of times I know you know about poly victimization. Do you see that often, to where you've seen survivors who have been victimized multiple times?
Well, very often, multiple times by multiple different people, and they'll end up going back to the previous traffickers. Or it's also a very insular world where a lot of people don't know each other, so they're moving from different traffickers, and their friends and the people that become close with, they're all running in the same circles, which make cooperation even more challenging, where everybody knows if someone's a cooperating victim, especially when it involves an adult who might still be out there engaging in prostitution. Everybody knows that she's the victim, the witness on that case, and their trafficker friend or their co-pimp, or if there's another woman working for that same pimp, my man is in jail because you're testifying. Those are all those heightened risks that may not be present in other types of cases.
Right, and I've experienced that as well. What so do you do at the onset of getting the case that accounts for the possibility that this victim survivor may not be able to be present or participate in the criminal process? Are there any special measures that you take?
So from the onset, when a new case comes in, whether it's an arrest or a tip or a referral, we're always evaluating it, recognizing for that possibility. We're always trying to gather the evidence and build that case, knowing that, well, whether we have the cooperation and the participation of the victim right now, we know that down the line it may not happen, or we may not have it to begin with. So we're always kind of framing the interview, framing the evidence we're looking for in the subpoenas and search warrants, trying to build a wraparound case, recognize that we may not be able to go forward with the direct testimony from the victim. So when we're working with the actual victim on a case where we have their cooperation in the beginning, or they're willing to speak with us, we're going to have that full MDT style team. We're going to have the interview together with the social worker, with the detective and the prosecutor all at once. But in the beginning, have that social worker do that needs assessment, do that intervention. What is happening in their life right now? What might be the challenges to prevent them from continuing in a case? What are their main concerns right now? Oftentimes when a case first comes in, if there's children, if there's health, medical, government, like, we'll try to see what is the most pressing need that they need right now, so they can be comfortable, so we can kind of like provide those wraparound that then now they have that headspace to continue with the cooperation of a prosecution. And oftentimes, if we know it may not get that far, or during that interview, we're talking about different methods where we're getting intelligence for subpoenas and different avenues to find that evidence that we can build that case where we know that we can help tell that story without that victim's direct testimony if we need to. But just giving them the tools and that groundwork to get them in the best possible place where they can continue with a case if they want to choose that way.
As the chief, you have prosecutors that are deputies who you supervise. How do you help them with going that comprehensive as far as being victim centered and being supportive and working with the multidisciplinary team members, but still managing like a full caseload? How does that balance work, and what do you suggest like to support it so you can be more efficient but still be just as comprehensive?
So that's why we also have that team effort, because everyone that comes to the Brooklyn DA's office and works within human trafficking and special victims is trained on trauma response and understanding trauma, how it works with victims, how people and survivors deal with trauma, to understand how we can inform our practice and how our cases work. But we also know our roles. We're prosecutors, we're working with analysts, we're working with investigators, we work with the social worker. And through that whole collaborative team, like I like to call it like an informal MDT, everyone is relying on each other to get that full picture. So it's not all resting on the shoulders of my assistant. And in New York, there are ADAs, there are assistant DAs, where we're working with that team effort, where we're coming together saying, hey, we have this potential victim here. The social worker is going to do that needs assessment. We're going to do the questioning to talk about trying to identify potentially other victims or other witnesses that can develop other evidence, and then rely on the investigators and the analysts to start building that out and building out that network. So we're each coming with our expertise from that team effort. And sometimes it's easier than done. And on a busy time, a lot of referrals come in. You're kind of trying to you're going into crisis mode and dealing with emergencies like normal. But we try to kind of take each case by itself and see what we have, what we can develop, and the best way to move forward on that case.
I think that's such an important point, and it really deserves unpacking even a bit more, because one of the things that I always thought was significant that I felt that sometimes people miss, they sometimes wait until trial to worry about how to adjust to maybe a victim or survivor not being present, when really that work has to start at the investigation stage, at the time the incident happens, and even before then, with developing the relationships with the parties that you just mentioned, like with all of the different social workers and community-led organizations, survivor-led organizations, that the work has to precede the actual need for the services. And so I think a lot of times that is often missed, because if you wait until trial or until the case happens, you're already behind that 8 ball. Do you do a lot of outreach work?
Yes, we do. So we have, as part of the Brooklyn Human Trafficking Task Force, we do a lot of trainings through our partners and through the DA's office, through professional outreach, through different industries. Like we just recently hosted a training with Truckers Against Trafficking for spotting trafficking in the transportation, where New York has a very big bus terminal where potential minors are running away from their foster care or going through New York and passing through. So training those workers and police officers there to spot trafficking, and we've had some successful prosecutions that came from the dedicated work of those officers seeing potentially trafficked youth and adults. So we do a lot within the different industries and sectors, where we hosted several years ago a big training within the healthcare industry of recognizing the signs when someone's coming in and presenting with certain type of injuries and how those things might be connected. And we've gotten a lot of referrals that way. Also, we started doing several years ago outreach in the community, in the street. And in Brooklyn, there's a particular area which is known as like the street prostitution track, and trying to be thinking of innovative ideas and how to address it, and not to just start doing enforcement and doing arrests, which obviously is not helpful and won't help. But we're going out there at the times when they're there. We're not just setting up a table at 2 p.m. saying, hey, here we're at with resources, when we're not expecting to see anyone. We're going out there at midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., when they're out there with different outreach professionals, and we're engaging with them. We're talking to them, not from the law enforcement side, but just, hey, we're here to help. Here's some food. Here's some clothing. The the Salvation Army caseworkers are going out there talking to them. What do they need? And potentially if they need help with shelter and case management, we're offering all that and letting them see like, hey, we know you're out here. Obviously, if there's violence or we see potential minors, then that changes it a little bit. But we're going to do outreach all the time and say, when you feel comfortable, when you feel trustworthy enough with us that you can make a call, here's our number. We'll be here on a regular. And we've gotten those. When they start seeing the vans come by, they're like, oh, you guys are back. It's winter time. They're asking for hand warmers or different type of food or things like that, which the caseworkers are bringing that to them to try to build that trust, where eventually that could lead to a call and a referral, or a call for help, and a call, I'm ready to come in, I'm ready to get out, please help.
Oh, that's great, because I think that also is another piece that's missed. That community involvement is huge. Now, you're talking about reaching out and doing the outreach with the community. Do you work with training like judges, and how do you tackle explaining these complex concepts to judges and juries so that they understand what the trauma response looks like?
So we have done that. We've hosted through our office as well as with the task force. We've done several CLE for the defense bar, for people in our own office, and for the judges, talking about the signs of trafficking, recognizing it, recognizing different situations, and how they can spot that. And in court, when cases are pending through trial, we're doing that through the use of experts, with whether it's experts with lived experience who can explain the dynamics of trafficking, or law enforcement or other type of or medical experts that can speak to those dynamics of what a victim might be going through to educate them, because the signs are very different. And someone in a courtroom when the victim is testifying doesn't see the outside factors. They don't understand all the backstory that us as a law enforcement will see when we're doing an investigation. What actually makes it inside the courtroom is very narrow than what's going on, whether it's through the just rules of evidence or what's admissible. That's not always telling the entire story, where the jurors can really resonate and understand what a victim goes through, or the judge. So we have different methods of kind of talking about how they went through to make that their testimony credible and teach the juries that this is real and what the dynamics are, while also teaching about what the myths aren't, and where everyone watches certain TV shows and news and movies and has their own impression. But now they're coming to trial and they're seeing something which they never expected, and kind of really change their mindset of what trafficking actually is.
I practiced in California, so I think the laws may have been a little different as to what could come in as far as context, but making it a priority to get that context in, right? To really do those motion and limines and pretrial motions so you can really paint the full picture, I always thought was hugely successful, because even when victims and judges, they might not understand like the unique dynamics as it comes to trafficking and subculture and terms and practices and those type of things, but it seems like they understand like the human condition. They understand what abuse really looks like when you can point it out and show why somebody has been vulnerable. So what you said about bringing in the context has also been something that when I was working as a prosecutor, something that I really emphasized to do so that the jury or the judge, whoever the trier of fact was, could get an understanding.
And just to add to that also, because oftentimes all they see is that question and answer. And obviously when it's a direct question from the prosecutor, it's much more, it's scripted, they're prepared to say that. But then they get cross-examination, and defense attorney's job is to trip them up, get them in credibility admissions, and make the jury not like the witness, which is what their job is. And what the jury may not recognize right away is survivors, they've always been survivors, whether it's before the case happened, while it's going, they're in fight or flight mode. Their survivor mechanism is what's kept them going for all these years, all these months, or whatever the situation might be. And someone like that who's still in that survive, fight, or flight mode will potentially translate poorly on their witness stand, where they're being very defensive and combative, and they can come across as, oh, they're being incredible, they're not being truthful, or a jury may not like that person. And that's part of that training, that we have to understand that this is their defensive mechanism. We would have a psychologist expert to talk about that. When your back is against the wall, your mechanism of fight can become hostile, but recognize that this is their defensive mechanism. And here are the other signs of through the case and the evidence and the way they answer certain questions to show that they can be reliable and they're not incredible and, oh, a bad witness because they lost their temper, when a defense attorney's job, and a trained defense attorney whose job is to get that witness to be tripped up. So it's really important to kind of explain that also ahead of time, that this isn't going to be as clean as a jury would expect to see.
Right. And I find that when you do that, it helps manage their expectations so they're not as shocked when they see something that maybe is not the stereotypical idea of what they might think a victim is. So I do think coming in really transparently in the beginning is super important, and hitting all those past areas of trauma. Now, outside of really explaining trauma and taking all those measures that you described, the evidence-based prosecution, can you tell us what it is and how you work to build that when you have human trafficking cases?
Sure. And evidence-based prosecution, even when we don't have other evidence, we just have the witness, that is still obviously an evidence-based prosecution, because witness testimony is evidence. But in that context that people are more familiar when they hear that term, that's more proceeding on a case where you don't have direct victim testimony. You're building what we would call a paper case, where we're using all the records and all the evidence that normally would support and corroborate a story. That is telling that story, where we're getting digital records. In our office, we're very heavy reliant on digital evidence when it comes to cell phones and cloud data and just all types of. Listen, society has moved to that cell phone in your hand, in your pocket, is your life. Everything is on there, your personal, your business, your family, your financial, everything that you cannot do anything without having your cell phone. So that tells a huge story. We're using the messages from cell phones, the conversations, to tell the story for that victim that might not be ready or comfortable to testify. But we have the direct messages with the trafficker. We're having financial transactions when a customer is paying for sex, and oftentimes now they're using different financial messaging systems where they're sending money. That way we have those transactions. We have business records. We have hotel records. We're doing search warrants on email accounts. Anything where you could think of where you're communicating with someone, that's possible for law enforcement and prosecutors to obtain. And we're using, obviously with proper lawful process, we're using that to understand that story, to really tell that entire story of what's going on. Because oftentimes, even when you have the cooperation of the victim, and this is something, when it hit me, and I really understood how this trauma dynamic works, where you're expecting someone who potentially on a trafficking situation, let's say, that's been going on for several months, and night becomes day, day becomes night. They're out in the streets for hours. They're being forced to take drugs just to keep them mentally prepared to do this, what they have to do. They don't know what day it is, what time it is, where that was. They're getting in a car. The trafficker, if he has his own car, is driving them to the date, to the hotel, to the street, or the customer, the John, is sending them in an Uber or things like that, or the customer or the purchaser is sending them in an Uber or something like that. They don't know where they are. They don't know that they were in Brooklyn, or they crossed the bridge and now they're in Manhattan, or they crossed the street and now they're in Queens, which are all three different jurisdictions that we potentially would have to deal with in New York. And then us as prosecutors, we need a theory. We need a timeline. We need to be able to build that case. And this is in a situation even where we have that victim who's ready and willing and saying, I want to testify, but they just don't know when the crime happened. They thought it happened on a Tuesday, but it really happened on a Monday. And if we have that victim now going and testify that she's sure it happened that Tuesday at the hotel on the south side of town, if the defendant has a message on his phone showing he was somewhere else, or Easy Pass records or tolls that he was somewhere else, that shows that the victim is not being credible, or that she isn't trustworthy because her memory isn't great. But also then that provides a problem when we have charging documents saying those things. So we're using these evidence and we're using all these tools that we have to be able to build that timeline properly, where it's lock solid and it explains why the victim may not remember, because they were in 4 different places on one night. We can't expect them to understand, to remember certain things. If you asked me what I had for breakfast last week, I wouldn't remember. Yet we're going back when we have a historical trafficking case or a long-term case, asking the victim, hey, what hotel did you go to 6 months ago on a Wednesday night? And getting frustrated when they don't know the answer. And that's why it's our jobs to be able to do that thorough investigation, understand how to question and I don't, not interrogating any man, but like how to question the victim properly, where we're getting those different scenarios where they can remember what type of time of the day it was, where is it winter or summer, all different type of things that when you're doing like trauma training, to ask not direct questions, but kind of things that can trigger memory remembrances that we can then use to then follow up and do that subpoena, look for surveillance video, look for things that can corroborate what that victim said, and build that case to make it as strong as possible, where there is no issues of remembrance, which could then potentially jeopardize a case when a defense attorney will just use that lack of a remembrance of which restaurant they sat in to say that the victim is not believable.
Right. And a lot of times when prosecutors are not trauma informed, or any of the professionals really are not trauma informed, they can take those inconsistencies and view them as a bad fact. And that will affect like how the prosecution unfolds from that point forward. So knowing, one, that trauma will affect the memory. So really being trauma informed and knowing how that relates to the case. And that just because the response is present in the case doesn't make it a bad fact. It just means that you have to understand and unpack that trauma for the jury or the judge, whoever the trier of fact is. That part is huge. And the other part that I used to like about the evidence-based prosecution, it was really like the area that I liked quite a bit when it came to these cases, is that it does help nail down like the facts of what happened, like this date and time and this location. But it also in there, you see the dynamic that your expert will talk about. You see the communications. You see sometimes survivors asking to eat. Can I take a break? And you see the responses. You see the level of control and coercion and intimidation. You see all that dynamic as it plays right there because you have like all those communications. So to really appreciate everything you get from all the different digital evidence and all the different other forms of evidence is huge because you have a picture to paint, but you do have a lot to work with when it comes to like if you have a really robust digital investigation. So with that being said, so when the case concludes and you've done everything you can, trauma informed, and you've presented the evidence as best you can with whatever evidence it is that you have outside of victim testimony, when the case concludes, what um relationship do you still have with survivors, or what support do you see that needs to be extended to survivors once the case concludes, but the trauma kind of still exists?
We absolutely have a responsibility to work with that victim. Just because the case is over does not mean we say we're done, you're on your own, and good luck. We will continue that support with our office. And I should say that before even a case concludes, even on those investigations where the victim is unwilling to participate or is not ready or is afraid, we're not closing that door and saying we're done, we're not going to help you. Like, our social worker is still available. We still will work with that victim survivor. We have on more often than not, the first phone call when we have a new case or a new referral is that social worker reaching out to them. And sometimes a case never materializes, but they'll stay in contact and they'll provide that support, whatever our office can help. In terms of support, we're constantly doing that. So even before the case is over, even if a case never happens, we're having that relationship. But when a case does happen and the case is finished, when it results in a plea or a conviction at trial or an acquittal, if that also happens, but obviously usually more pleas and convictions, when the investigation is done thoroughly, our social worker stays in contact. Last week I had a call from a victim that was the very first trafficking case I had in 2014. I got a call recently and still talking to her and had some questions and about the case or the long term. We're still there. We're never turning off the phone and saying, hey, you lost, the business is done, the deal is over, we're finished. We're constantly providing that support. And oftentimes, and more often than not, it's just a social worker. The case is over, so there's no real edits or updates that I can give. Sometimes if it's a potential of the person is getting out of jail soon or they're getting released or there's an upcoming hearing, they're fighting some type of appeal, there might be questions where I have from that side. But oftentimes it's more support from the social services side, and our social worker is there. Again, a lot of times we will refer cases to our partners, our social service partners that have that confidentiality, that can provide certain support that we can just being a DA's office. And they'll stay in that contact and we'll reconnect, or, hey, I was on a case 5 years ago and now I need help. Here's these people that you can talk to for help. So that relationship is ongoing as much as the victim wants it to be. And throughout the case as well, when the case is pending, we're calling the victim as much as she wants it. And if the victim wants to be kept informed of the ongoings of the court case every week, we're calling every week. If they don't want to be called, unless it's something important, we'll wait on that. So everything we do is guided by the needs and the wants of that victim. Some like a lot more hand-holding, and some call me only if it's an emergency. And we'll kind of use that as a guide. And like I said, we get calls years after cases are finished, and we'll still be there. We'll answer the phone and help however we can.
It looks like we have a question from our listening community, and it is on something that you've already spoke on, but it would be great if you could expand how you help juries understand the impact of the trauma. So, with that narrow, small amount of time that you have with the juries, what are some of the approaches or strategies that you use just to help them understand how trauma impacts a survivor?
So initially, it starts before the trial, before the testimony side. The beginning of that trial, their first understanding and impression of the case is jury selection or voir dire, where they're coming into court. They don't know any of the facts of the case. They don't know if it involves an adult or a minor or force or coercion. They don't know anything. They just know the charge is trafficking. And that's our job as prosecutors to kind of, through the jury selection, talk to them about that. And that's also our only time to actually talk to that jury and hear from the jury. Oftentimes it's we give an opening, we give a summation, we do have the witness testimony, but we're never learning what the jury actually knows or wants or cares about. And we assume certain things. We assume they know what trafficking is. We assume that they'll believe the person because someone's coming in and saying a crime was committed. Jury selection is our first chance to really ask them questions to be like, hey, juror number one, juror number two, when I say the word sex trafficking, what does that mean to you? What do you assume or imagine a trafficking scenario is? Or you see this person sitting there and you know now he's being charged with trafficking. What's your impression? And we'll get varying degrees of all the myths. Oh, this was an international case. This was a this. Or people, the biggest thing I find a lot is people do not understand the dynamic of domestic trafficking. They don't realize it. They don't understand it. They see what makes the TV shows and the run-of-the-mill person living in their neighborhood who down on their luck and was recruited and forced, again, whether a minor or an adult, where the domestic trafficking, like working in the hotels, working on the corners, that's not something that they would understand. So that's the first part, is just before even getting into the case specifics, dealing with the myths of trafficking and what it is and what it isn't. And I know when I first became a prosecutor close to 20 years ago, doing general crimes and violent crimes, CSI was the biggest TV show out there. And everybody expected that every case we're going to bring in DNA and fiber and that little strand of hair, which would prove the entire case. And that obviously doesn't happen. And that's what we would have to talk to the jury about. This is not a CSI episode. This is real life. And now moving over to trafficking, it's the similar thing. So through jury selection, we're kind of, as best as the judge will allow us to get it out, talking about what their beliefs are trafficking and kind of explaining what it really is. When we're dealing with an adult victim, oftentimes it's very challenging when we're trying to prove that force element, because that's oftentimes where the credibility issues come into play. With strict liability when it comes to minors, prostitution happened, the third party control, the trafficker profited from it. It doesn't matter whether there was consent involved or not. When an adult, that's what we have to prove. And oftentimes there's a lot at play here where there are those credibility issues. Some of the dynamics of how traffickers do, they'll pit one girl against each other to make them who likes the trafficker more, who's higher up, or who's getting the benefit. So I'll have the girls fight each other, do other crimes, rob the customers, steal, do different things that will go towards their credibility. And using experts, that's how we teach the jurors. That's how we explain their behaviors to have a context of understanding why they were acting the way they are, and why just because they may have done this thing wrong, or they're angry, they're impatient when they answer questions, it's not because they're lying, it's because of what is going on with them. And I say there's three different type of experts, I think, that really can paint that picture well. The first is a survivor, someone with lived experience who is not coming and testifying and saying, in this particular case, I know this victim and this is why they did the way they did, but they're sharing from their own stories of how how the trauma bonding with them works, the dynamic of how a trafficking scenario goes, how the money happens, the rules of the game. When you come with street tracks, I know in Brooklyn and in other cities, the old school pimp rules still apply, where the women walking on the street have to stay in the middle of the street. They can't go on the sidewalk. They can't talk to a pimp unless it's their own. Like, there's all these rules that ultimately end up in violence that people think that's not happening anymore. Can't even understand that a concept like that still goes on. So we would have someone who to give them the realities of what trafficking is from that first person experience, and then talk about why it may not be so easy to leave, whether they're still getting provided for, things like that. We would have also the law enforcement experts, sometimes a detective, talk about the areas where the prostitution is occurring, how payment is made, different type of prices. So on a case where we may not have that victim, but we have text messages where a lot of the messages are abbreviations and referencing different prostitution encounters and money and areas, the detective can give that explanation to give the jury an understanding of what different things are. And then, like I mentioned, we also have the psychologist who could talk about it for the medical and the trauma bonding and how the mind works and how the mind will potentially make someone think that they're more in love with the person, even though all signs that someone who's removed from it say, oh, that's an unhealthy relationship. I mean, I think we're all keen to like look at our friends and family members and say, hey, this is a bad scenario for you. You're making mistakes, because we're looking at it from impartial, objective eyes. But when you understand where they are, it's not objective. It's not so easy to be like, why didn't you leave them? You should have just left. Here was your escape opportunity. But there's a lot more factors at play that will prevent the survivor from being able to leave. And that's kind of how we're educating the courtroom, the judges, and the juries to understand those dynamics.
All right, thank you for that, because all that is hugely important, so they get a full understanding of what's happening. Now, before you leave us, David, we have a practice where at the close of each episode, we do 3 rapid fire questions, and they're not aggressive questions, and I'm really not that fast, so they're not all that rapid. But we do 3 rapid fire questions that I would like to do now, if you are ready.
Sure.
Okay. What is something that you've learned from a survivor that changed how you work?
That they're people first and foremost. I know oftentimes when you're a prosecutor and you're dealing with different cases and papers coming in and their names on a paper, there's street locations, and you're kind of going through the motions and not recognizing that there's a real person behind that. And I think it's very important to recognize, like, what's your needs? What is going on with you? Learn all about that person to be able to inform how you can handle your case properly, and understand what is work going in their life, and treat them like a regular person. Oftentimes someone might be like, oh, that's a survivor, we can't talk to them. Or there's like, they put them in like on a cloud somewhere as like, it's like almost like a unicorn, not a real person. But recognize that they're people just like us. They're going through different challenges than we might be, but understand what they want. In the same way that when you're working a robbery case and you're speaking to the victim, hey, what do you want to see happen here? Treat them with that same understanding and dignity. And I think just recognize that their challenges might be different and unique than what you might be accustomed to, but they are regular people who deserve the same protections of the law, and they're not the discarded part of society that people want to just move on from.
What is one resource or tool that you would recommend for everybody in the field?
Be a member of the email from Equitas.
Awesome.
And it's true. Like, Equitas is an incredible resource that I relied on them many years ago when I was preparing for trial, in terms of specifically for prosecutors working human trafficking, special victim type cases. The resources, the attorney advisors are the resources they can give you in terms of how to craft a jury questionnaire or your certain issues, certain challenges. Absolutely, that is a wonderful tool for prosecutors. And I think that is a great resource that everybody should be aware of if people have not heard of Equitas. From the forensic side, I think there's different forensic tools that we use, which I think kind of go towards also that victim-centered methodology where, like, for example, Data Pilot, and not to exclude others, is one. They have handheld extractions that we can take in the field, that when we're going out to do an interview with a victim, we can take their phone, get that extraction, and not have to take their phone from them. I know that's always a big challenge when we have to take cell phones. Like, we're leaving someone without a phone, but also there's a lot of evidence on there, and for some reasons, like certain reasons, we can't not take it. But having different forensic tools where we can go in and do extraction and say, hey, we're taking this device, we're taking the information, but you're keeping your phone. I think that goes a long way to building that trust as well, showing that we're caring about you. We're not just doing what we want for our case, but we're going to make whatever we can work.
Awesome. And then the final question is, what's one sign of progress that you see right now in the field?
I think recognizing victims and recognizing where they are and how we handle them, how we treat cases, how we look on them. I think from the law enforcement side, we made a big push into just let's arrest everyone, let's prosecute everyone, and let the chips fall where they may. To now we understand the dynamics. We understand forced criminality. We understand things that are happening to them that are different than, oh, you've committed a crime. You committed prostitution, we'll arrest you. And now it's no, let's look at behind that. Why are you out here? What's happening to you? Doing innovative investigations, using the different tools that law enforcement has to build these cases properly, generate to identify new victims, and then innovative prosecutions, such as evidence-based or things like that, where we can work these cases and understand these cases and make a difference, where we're recognizing all the people as part of it. And I think law enforcement is moved. There's obviously a lot more that needs to be done, but I think law enforcement has done a very good job of identifying victims, training their frontline staff, training officers, training detectives that aren't in the trafficking division, and then in the prosecutor's office as well, recognizing cases where that come into our office as an assault case or a narcotics case, and hey, there's a trafficking nexus that now is getting a call to me or the police department saying, hey, this is more than just fill in the blank type of case, but there is a trafficking underlying here, and then that can become an investigation.
Thank you so much for that. And I agree when it comes to that you do see the progress. As difficult as the challenges are, you do see the progress in the field. So you just hope that it can continue and you do what you can to support that momentum. And then finally, I want to thank you for coming on and sharing your resourceful approach to these complex prosecutions that you are actually doing, that it's not abstract, that you are actually in the practice of doing, that building the strong cases that protect victim dignity when victims may not be able to participate. And that doesn't mean that the criminal prosecution needs to stop. So we are very grateful for you to share your insights, and congratulations on your award if I didn't mention that to you before. And thank you for sharing your expertise. And then to our listeners, we are asking that you remember that every survivor-centered approach, every trauma-informed courtroom, and every thoughtful intervention is a step toward that lasting change, that justice that's lasting and sustainable. It's not easy work, as we've described. It can take the collaboration of multiple partners, but it's necessary in order to truly show up for their survivors. So thank the listeners who are out there doing the work as well. For more information about Equitas, go to equitasresource.org. That's AEQUITAS, resource.org. Or follow us on Equitas_resource on Instagram. The series is executive produced by Jennifer Long, Miko Anderson, Equitas, and Robin Hopkins. Our production coordinator is Eleni Angeles, and the series is sound designed and edited by Brian J. Lighton.